Right, hello and good afternoon, or whenever it is that you're listening to this. So I'm Boaz Moselle. I am presenting the first part of BSC Module 9, Competition Law and the Regulation of Network Industries. It is April 2021, and I'm going to begin by sharing screen so you can see my slides. And I hope that you can now see my slides, and I will get going. Thank you very much. Very good. So, as I said, I am Boaz Moselle. What's the first thing that I want to tell you? It is what we're doing today. So here we are on slide 1, the content slide. This course falls into 4 parts. They're somewhat self-explanatory. I'm going to give the introduction now, and in the introduction, I will explain to you why we have divided this course between regulation of networks and competition over the network. So without more ado, let me go to slide 3. And I'll begin with the substance. So I'll begin with some intellectual history. The starting point of all of this is an observation which, as you can see, goes back to the 19th century. So this is a British economist called Thomas Farrer, and he wrote, "There is a large and constantly increasing class of industrial undertakings possessing privileges which give them more or less the character of monopolies, and which thus call for special regulation by the state." And he gave a lot of examples. So harbors, canals, docks, roads, bridges and ferries, so that's all transportation industries, railways, tramways and so on. Then he said gasworks, that's an energy utility. They didn't have electricity then, but they had gas. Waterworks, that's a water utility. And then post office and telegraphs, so the telecommunications of the time. And having identified these industries, he wrote about some of the problems they had. So he said, in some of these industries, competition has been attempted, others have been monopolies from the start, but in none of them has competition proved to be completely successful. And we can actually go back even earlier, back to 1848. So the philosopher John Stuart Mill wrote that there are many cases in which a practical monopoly cannot be prevented from existing. And he talks about the gas and water companies and says, look, they're terrible. Although in theory, they're not monopolies, in practice, they are monopolies. So we have these kinds of industries where the question of how to get effective competition and get good outcomes for consumers has been around for coming up to 200 years now. That's quite remarkable in a way. And those industries are the subject of this module. So I'll go to slide 5. The module talks about network industries. I've given you a bunch of industries as examples. What do we mean by a network industry? Well, conceptually, I'm going to say there are 2 key features that make it a network industry. First of all, there's one part of the supply chain which is infrastructure that is what's called a natural monopoly. And I'm going to talk about, or Ruxandra will talk about what a natural monopoly is in some detail. And secondly, although you have this monopolistic infrastructure, you can also have competition because different firms can use the single set of infrastructure. And that all sounds perhaps a bit conceptual or mysterious, but let me give you some examples and then I hope it will become clear. So first of all, electric power. So for electricity, the wires, the transmission and distribution wires are a natural monopoly. We don't have different competing sets of transmission wires, we only have one. So that's the first feature. But we do have competition. So different power stations compete to produce electricity, and they use the single monopoly set of wires to sell that electricity to their customers. And a second example, railways. So again, rails are the actual things that the trains roll along are a natural monopoly. We generally don't have competing sets of rails, but we can and do have different companies that own trains and carriages that go along those rails and compete with each other, mainly in the transportation of goods. but sometimes for people as well. Okay, so those are some examples, and I hope that gives you a sense of what it is that makes these industries special at a conceptual level. And because of this feature, because we have the monopolistic part and then the part that can be competitive, these industries are a weird kind of hybrid. So I've put this rather cheesy picture up, but hopefully this will remind you that this is a kind of key feature, that there are two kind of very different aspects to any one of these industries. So on the one hand, some of it is a monopoly, it's an essential good or service. It's the kind of thing you expect to regulate. So like the water industry, the water pipes or the electricity wires. And on the other hand, there's tremendous potential for competition. And I gave the example here of low-cost airlines because airlines use airports. Airports are a kind of natural monopoly. Unless you have a very big city, we don't have competing airports. But at least until COVID came, you did have a lot of competition between airlines. Okay, so we have these industries, and one part can be very competitive, another part we expect to not be competitive at all. We expect it to be a regulated monopoly. Okay, so going to slide 7. We're going to talk about regulation of these industries. So before we get into that in detail, I want to introduce some vocabulary, and I want to make an important distinction. Okay. So the distinction, the vocabulary relate to, first of all, the question of what is competition law versus what is regulation. Okay. So when I say regulation, when Ruxandra says regulation in this course, what we're going to mean is economic regulation. So regulation of prices, regulation of output, regulation of the quality of service, how reliable does the electricity supply have to be, of contractual terms and so on. We don't mean, for instance, safety regulation. That's not where our expertise lies. And then the second observation is we talk about regulated industries, but actually all industries are regulated in our societies because they're subject to competition law. So the real distinction is between what is often called ex ante versus ex post regulation. Okay, what's the difference? Well, ex post regulation is where the framework is the company does what it wants, and if the responsible agency or public body thinks that it's misbehaving, then it comes in afterwards and says you shouldn't have done that. So that's how competition law mostly works. So a company can engage in certain behavior. It doesn't get permission in advance for setting prices or for writing contracts. But if it's prices or it's contracts and considered to be abusive and it's considered to be dominant, then you get ex post intervention by the competition authority. Similarly with anti-competitive agreements and so on. Less so with merger control, which is generally more of an ex ante approach. Okay, so that is ex post regulation. And then in contrast, we have ex ante regulation, which is not general. It's not applied to all sectors. It's applied to specific sectors, including most of the industries that we're thinking about in this course. And ex ante regulation involves the government or the government agencies writing rules in advance for the companies who are engaged in the sector. So typically rules which say this is the maximum price you can charge, rules which limit the profits, rules which require you to provide a certain minimum quality of service, to provide a certain level of investment and so on. Okay, and typically there's a sectoral regulator, a specialized agency, and as I said, these rules are applied in advance. So those are two very different kinds of regulation. And just to recap, we've now got we've had two distinctions, if you like. First of all, that network industries are a mix of regulation and competition, and secondly, that there are two forms of regulation. So when we think about public policy and what's the best way to manage a network industry, generally it's about getting the mix right. So if we think about electric power, for example, I said that one part, so the electric wires, are going to be a monopoly, and what you'd expect and what you see is that those electric wires are then subject to ex ante regulation. So in every member state, there's a regulator. The regulator sets rules for how the wires should work and how much people can be charged for using the wires. Whereas, as I said, generation is an activity where you can have competition, and therefore the level of ex ante regulation of electricity generation is much less. To a large extent, we rely on competition law to ensure that electricity generators behave themselves. There's competition law, and then there are other sector-specific bits of ex post regulation as well. So you see another cheesy picture here, again, just trying to reinforce in your mind that the point I've just made, really, that we want to get the best of both worlds, that we want to use ex ante regulation to prevent abuse of monopoly power by the network, but we want to use more light-handed regulations, so ex post competition law type regulation, because we think that's more conducive to competition. And in other parts of the supply chain, like in generation, we want to promote competition because we think that will be most beneficial to consumers. Okay, moving to slide 11. So how does that work in practice? How do we manage to achieve this double goal of regulating the network and having competition at the same time? Well, I will describe this in more detail as we go through the course, through the module, but to give you a kind of overview now, the model that is largely applied in many of these industries in the EU, so I talk mostly about energy, that's my particular knowledge, but the same is certainly true of telecoms, of rail, and of a number of the other industries, is what's called an open access model or a third-party access model. Okay? And the way that works is that you have the network, which one entity owns and operates, and that is regulated. And so we have the independent regulator that sets the prices and so on. And then we have many different firms who are able to use the network. And one aspect of the regulation is making sure that there's a level playing field, that those different firms can all use the network on the same terms, because that will promote competition. And as I've written on the slide here, that is what we might call the standard model design for gas, for electricity, and for telecoms. And as we'll describe a bit as we go forwards, it's also used, for instance, in parts of the rail industry. It's used in some places in water and so on. And that is called the third-party access model. It's called third-party access because in the olden days, it was typically the case that you had a vertically integrated company that, for instance, was the incumbent electricity company that would generate electricity and use the wires to supply its customers. And then when we, the EU, moved to this model, we said, okay, company, monopoly, you thought there were only two people involved, you and your customer, but now there's a third person who's involved, which is this new entrant. The new entrant wants to use your network to take your customer away from you, and you don't like that, I'm sure, but tough luck, because we're going to set rules so that you have to allow them to use your network. So that's the idea. To give you an example, it's a slightly random example in a sense, but in Belgium, the gas transmission network, so gas transmission refers to the high pressure, long distance pipelines that are used to move natural gas around the country. It belongs to Fluxys, which is an independent company. So Fluxys isn't involved in natural gas production or natural gas sales. It's just a company that manages the network. And then there are lots of different companies who are able to use that that network, so the Fluxys gas transmission pipelines, to supply gas to their customers, and those different firms compete with each other to supply gas to their customers. And we hope and we believe that that leads to an efficient industry structure and is beneficial to consumers. And we have today 34 registered companies. I think slide 11 says as of June 2018, but actually I updated this slide this morning and it's actually as of 2020. So slide 12 shows you, just proves that I'm not making this up, the list on the website of the Belgian Federal Energy Regulator, the CREG, of natural gas suppliers in Belgium. Okay. So I said that that is the standard model used in the EU, and that is the model that most of this module will be looking at. Let me quickly, though, tell you about some other approaches. So there are other ways of dealing with the network industries, and historically, the model we have now in the EU really goes back 20 or 30 years. Before that, things were done differently. So here are two alternative ways of dealing with the network industry. And it may be helpful to think about railway, and that's the example I've given here, because the railway industry uses all these different approaches in different countries. So one thing you could do with the railway industry is just say, this is a monopoly, there's one company, this is our national railway company, and they do it all. And that's how things used to be, for instance, in the United Kingdom until I don't know, 1990 or so. It's how things used to be, I believe, in France with SNCF and so on. Another approach you can have is to say, okay, this railway line, let's say we're talking about the line from London to Edinburgh, up the east coast of the United Kingdom. This railway line is a monopoly. It makes sense for it to be a monopoly, but that doesn't mean that it has to be the national rail company that operates the monopoly. What we can do as a government is go out to tender and say, we want someone to run this line for the next 15 years. And we're going to have a tender process, and we ask for the person who will charge the lowest fares, or in some cases, like if it's a railway line to a remote area that doesn't have very much business, that needs to be subsidized, but we want to keep it going for social reasons, we might say, we'd like to have a tender and see who is willing to operate this line and who will do it for the next 10 years for the smallest amount of subsidy. So there are different ways of setting this out, but that's what's called the franchise model, and sometimes called competition for the market. So the distinction that's made is, if you have different companies competing, let's say you had two different train companies that both run trains between London and Edinburgh, then we say those companies are both in the market and they're competing in the market. But if, as I've just described, if the authorities say, no, there'll just be one company, it's going to be a monopoly, and we're going to award that through a tender, then the different companies that enter in the tender are competing with each other. They're competing for the market because they're competing to become the monopoly operator. Okay. And as I said, all three of these approaches, so the two I've just described and also the third-party access model that we touched on in the previous slide, are all used in the rail industry in Europe. So on the right, you see a graph. It's a bit out of date now, but I think it's informative anyway, which shows you how the rail market is managed. Sorry, the passenger rail market is managed in some different countries. So, for instance, if you look on the left, you see that is the first bar on the left is Sweden, and it has a blue bit and a green bit. So the blue bit says that corresponds to a tendered PSO, public service obligation. So I think what that means is that there are parts of the rail network which are probably uneconomic. So they might be, I'm guessing here, but they might be in remote parts of Sweden, since Sweden is a really, really big and empty country. And the authorities say, we want someone to run this network, and we put it out to tender, and they probably, at least part of it is probably looking for the least required subsidy. And then the green part of that bar in the graph corresponds to open access commercial services. That is the third-party access model that I described earlier. So there you could have competing trains. That's Sweden. If we move across to Germany, so the fourth bar across, you can see there's blue, there's green, and there's red. The red is directly awarded. That is more like a legal monopoly. So I don't know how they do this. I guess they give it to maybe a state or federal company. But that is that anyway is closer to the legal monopoly. And then if you look at the Netherlands or Denmark, you see that mostly they rely on, it's mostly yellow, mostly they rely on the traditional legal monopoly service. I think the difference between the red and the yellow is that the yellow is monopoly on a profitable route, and the red is monopoly on an unprofitable route that requires subsidy. Okay, so it's a mixed picture, but as you see, for passenger rail, different countries do all these different things. Then for freight, this is something you may not be aware of, but most countries, or many countries in Europe, do have different competing companies who compete to carry. So freight means transporting goods by rail. So that's the story with rail. How does it work? What works and what doesn't? Well, the one useful source of evidence is the United Kingdom. So what I'm telling you about here on slide 14 is the conclusions of an investigation that was done in 2016 by the CMA, that's the UK Competition Authority, the Competition and Markets Authority. Okay. So their investigation was into passenger rail services, but I'll tell you about freight and passenger. Okay. So in freight, the UK has a very competitive rail market, and it works really well. So we have 7 companies. None of them are subsidized. The government doesn't tell them what services they have to give. They compete a lot between each other. They also compete with road. So if you want to send goods, you can send them by rail, or you can send them in trucks on the road. And you can see here, there's a load of data on this slide, which I won't go through because you can read it, but it tells you that essentially competition in freight on rail has been very successful by many measures. And so that's a success story. And now let's go to slide 15, UK passenger rail. So what I'm telling you is this goes back to 2016, so obviously it's all pre-COVID. If you look back to slide 13, let's do that for a second. You can see the second bar along in the graph is almost all blue, which corresponds to tendered PSO. So mostly in the UK, passenger rail is based on a tendering process. So the example I gave you of the train between London and Scotland along the East Coast, that's a real world example. That's called the East Coast franchise. And has that done well by customers, by rail passengers, or has it done well by the taxpayer who has to subsidize? Well, some successes and some failures. So I'd have to be honest and say that the public perception in the UK is that it's horrible. And the reason why for that public perception, the reason for that public perception, I think I can show you on the next slide. So our trains are super crowded. So the left-hand picture is the typical pre-COVID British train. It's not a fun thing to be doing. I think that's a tube train actually, but that's part of the story. And the right-hand side is a picture that was famous for a while. It was the then leader of the Labour Party, so the second biggest political party in the UK, I took a train journey and had to sit on the floor. Wasn't very happy about it. So the public perception is that the UK passenger rail doesn't work well. Going back to slide 15, I think the reality is a bit more complex. So there's one big success story, which is that since the system was introduced, so since we privatized the system and introduced franchises, there's been a massive increase in the use of rail, so faster growth than in other major EU countries. And I see here that passenger satisfaction has improved since 2006. I have to say it was pretty low in 2006, and I think it probably was pretty low in 2016 as well. And against that, the negatives, well, as I said, there's the perception that our trains are crowded and horrible. It's a third-party access system, so there is a company that owns the rails. That company was called Railtrack, and it went bankrupt and had to be taken over by the government back in, this is 20 years ago now. And then some of the franchises also went bankrupt. And the amount of subsidy that's required has gone up a lot over time. And last of all, our rail tickets were, and probably still are, said to be the most expensive in Europe. So, so as I said, a mixed story. Okay, that's the end of the introduction. So just to recap, what have I told you? I've told you what a network industry is, that it's a mix of a monopoly part and a competitive part. And I've said that we're going to look at how they're regulated. We're going to focus on what's called the third-party access model, where you regulate the network and you have different companies competing to use the network. And those are the main things to take away, I think, from what I've said so far. So for the rest of this lecture or this module, Ruxandra will talk to you about the regulation part of this. I said that the first ingredient, if you like, is that we regulate the network. She's going to talk about why that's the right thing to do and how we do it. And then I'm going to come back and talk about the second ingredient, competition. I'm going to talk about how we make the competitive parts of the industry work, how we manage to enable and promote competition. And lastly, I'll talk about some specific topics. The main thing will be energy retail. So that is not competition between electricity generators or natural gas producers, but competition between different companies that try to sell electricity and gas to me and you. And that is it for now. So I'm going to stop this recording and hand over to Ruxandra.